Riverview Heights had always seemed like a picture-perfect community. It was the kind of place people dreamed of moving to when they wanted peace, comfort, and safety. The low hum of suburban life was exactly what you'd expect. Quiet streets, well-maintained lawns, and a sense of neighborly pride that never wavered. But beneath the surface of this picturesque community, things were beginning to shift. At the center of this tightly knit world was Karen Richardson, the president of the Riverview Heights Homeowners Association, HOA. To say she had power was an understatement. She didn't just run the HOA, she ruled it with an iron fist. Karen was the kind of person who demanded compliance in every little detail of life. Everything had to be in order, down to the most minuscule of rules. Flowers had to be a certain color. Trash bins could only be placed on the curb within a 30-minute window. No one could paint their front door without approval. Those who broke the rules were penalized, fined, and often shamed in front of their neighbors. It was a game of power, and Karen played it well. Her reign, however, was not without its whispers. Most of the residents of Riverview Heights, especially the older crowd, had long since given up trying to challenge her. They had learned the hard way that Karen's rules were absolute. To argue with her was to risk becoming a target for her next crusade. In fact, the more she exerted control, the more she relished the fear she inspired. People would nod and smile, but behind closed doors, the grumbling grew louder. At family gatherings, at dinner parties, people whispered about Karen's overreach, her obsession with perfection, and her willingness to destroy anyone who stood in her way. The young people, on the other hand, saw things differently. My daughter, Lily, had always been the outspoken one, a firecracker. Some might call her. She was only 16, but she had a sharp tongue and an even sharper mind. She didn't buy into the quiet compliance that most of the adults had succumbed to. She saw the rules for what they were: tyranny, wrapped in the guise of community standards. She wasn't afraid to call it out. It wasn't that Lily hated the idea of a well-maintained neighborhood. Far from it. She just couldn't stand the idea of people being controlled, manipulated, and forced into submission by one person's vision of how things should be. Karen, in her eyes, wasn't just an HOA president, she was a dictator. And, like any good teenager, Lily didn't shy away from making her feelings known. It started with Instagram posts. Lily, ever the social media maven, began to document the absurdities of Karen's HOA rules, highlighting how over-the-top and controlling they were. She didn't use her real name at first, only a private account under an alias, but the message was clear. Revolt against the HOA queen. She shared photos of neighbors receiving fines for absurd reasons. One neighbor fined for trimming their hedges on a Sunday, another for having a garden gnome that violated Karen's aesthetic guidelines. The posts went viral within our community, and soon, other residents joined in, voicing their complaints in the comments section. But Karen wasn't the type of person who took such things lightly. She had always maintained a perfect veneer of civility, but behind that calm exterior was a woman with an unsettling need for control. She didn't just want people to follow the rules. She needed them to. Anyone who defied her was a threat to her authority, and she couldn't tolerate that. She'd always made small threats behind the scenes, an email here, a phone call there, but now Lily had made her a public enemy, and Karen had a long memory. It wasn't just the HOA rules that bothered Lily, though it was the way Karen wielded her power. Every resident knew the unspoken rule: challenge Karen at your own peril. Whether it was a minor complaint about the community garden, a neighbor's fence that wasn't up to code, or even something as small as a disagreement over the color of someone's shutters, Karen had a way of making it personal. She would punish transgressions with fines, with threats of eviction, and with exclusion from community events. The entire neighborhood was under her thumb, and it made Lily sick to see how many people simply rolled over. But what set Lily apart was her courage to stand up and speak out. She didn't let fear control her, and she refused to be silenced. Her posts about Karen's abuse of power were only the beginning. She started organizing meetings with other like-minded residents, gathering information, and taking notes on every unjust rule, every fine that didn't make sense, every instance of Karen flexing her power. Lily didn't just want to expose Karen's corruption. She wanted to take her down. She was determined to rally the community against her, to create a movement that would expose the truth about what was happening in Riverview Heights. But that's when the first threats came. It started with anonymous messages, cryptic warnings in her inbox, telling her to stop stirring the pot. "We don't want trouble," one message said. "Karen can make your life hell." The messages grew more personal. "We know where you live. Your mother won't be able to protect you." But Lily wasn't afraid. She saw it as a badge of honor. To her, the threats were proof that she was getting under Karen's skin. Knew, though, that things were escalating. I've been watching from the sidelines, quietly supporting my daughter's efforts. But I also understood the dangerous game she was playing. The HOA wasn't just a group of well-meaning neighbors. It was a machine, and Karen was the engine that powered it. Every time Lily made a post, every time she spoke out, she poked at the very foundation of that machine. It was a Saturday evening when I saw Karen for the first time in weeks. She was standing by the community center, watching the kids play soccer. I noticed that she was staring directly at Lily, who was chatting with some of her friends by the playground. It was an odd look, cold, calculating. I saw it before Lily did. She was sizing her up, waiting for the right moment to make her move. And that's when I started to realize just how far Karen was willing to go. It wasn't just about rules anymore. It wasn't about the HOA. It was about control, about breaking anyone who dared to challenge her. That night, Lily was late getting home. She had gone to a friend's house for a sleepover, but when I tried to call her, she didn't pick up. I wasn't overly worried at first. It wasn't uncommon for her to lose track of time. But as the evening wore on, my anxiety grew. I tried calling again. No answer. By the time I had left the house to look for her, I knew something wasn't right. The air felt thick, as though something unseen was hanging over the neighborhood. I couldn't explain it, but it was a feeling I couldn't shake. When I arrived at the community center, there was no sign of Lily. The streets were eerily quiet. No one was outside. No cars in driveways. And as I approached the elevator I had last seen her earlier that afternoon, I knew that whatever was about to happen, it would change everything. I didn't know what to expect as I approached the building, but the sinking feeling in my gut told me that something was terribly wrong. The streets were quieter than usual, and the air felt as still, like the calm before a storm. Every step I took toward the entrance of Riverview Heights seemed to echo in the silence, amplifying my growing dread. I tried to reach Lily again, but her phone went straight to voicemail. Panic started to claw at my chest, but I pushed it down. She was probably just running late or had lost track of time. She'd done it before. But as I walked through the lobby of our building and past the familiar decorations, the framed photos of community events, the smiling neighbors from block parties, none of which felt comforting. Instead, it felt suffocating. I reached the elevator and pressed the button. The soft ping of the arrival bell startled me, and I stepped inside. I didn't know what I was looking for, maybe just some sign that everything was normal, that Lily would appear around the corner with her usual cheerful grin, asking about dinner or talking about some new protest idea she had for the HOA. But the elevator felt off. Too quiet, too empty. The door slid shut, and I found myself standing there, staring at the metal panel in front of me, still clutching my phone in one hand. I pressed Lily's name again, desperately willing her to answer. Still, nothing. My finger hovered over the button for the 5th floor, the floor where our apartment was located, but I hesitated. My instincts were screaming at me to stay put and wait for her, and then it happened. A soft sound, a muffled scream. I froze. It was unmistakable. A scream, one that sent a cold chill down my spine. My breath caught in my throat, and I instinctively pressed the emergency button on the panel, not even thinking. My thumb hovered over the intercom, but I didn't have time to speak. The speaker crackled, and a voice distorted and frantic came through. Ma, she's coming. The voice was Lily's, but it was strained, like she was struggling to get the words out. Then suddenly, the static over the intercom intensified, and her voice disappeared altogether, replaced by an ominous silence. I swallowed hard. What was happening? My heart started to race as I glanced at the elevator doors. Then around the empty shaft, the silence felt heavier now, as though it had swallowed up all the noise, leaving only an unsettling stillness behind. I didn't know whether to panic or hold it together, but I couldn't just stand there. I slammed my fist on the emergency button again, waiting for the operator to respond, but nothing happened. Then, without thinking, I jammed my finger into the floor number, any number, anything to make the elevator move. And that's when I heard it again. This time it was louder, closer, a dull thud, followed by another muffled scream. The sound was coming from the 5th floor. I didn't wait any longer. My instincts kicked in, and I rushed out of the elevator, my feet pounding the hallway as I ran toward the apartment. The whole building seemed eerily silent as I moved past the empty mailboxes and apartment doors. The hallway lights flickered slightly, casting long shadows across the walls. When I reached our door, I pounded on it, my hands shaking. "Lily? Lily?" I called, but there was no answer. My mind raced as I tried to think of the quickest way inside, but my hands fumbled at the door handle. I wasn't sure if it was locked or if it had just been left slightly ajar, but it didn't. But out of there was no time to check. I pushed the door open, my heart in my throat, and stepped into the apartment. The lights were off, and everything seemed strangely calm. It didn't look like Lily had been home for long. Her backpack was dropped on the couch, shoes scattered at the door. The place was quiet, too quiet. I stepped further into the apartment, calling out her name again. "Lily, where are you?" The kitchen was empty, as was the living room. I turned toward the hallway that led to her bedroom and froze. The door was slightly cracked open, and beyond it, I could hear the soft hum of the refrigerator in the other room. But there was no sign of Lily, no sign of anything out of the ordinary except for a strange, sticky patch on the carpet. I bent down to touch it, and my heart stopped. It was blood, fresh blood. My stomach churned as I stood up quickly, panic beginning to rise. It was only then that I noticed the faint trail leading down the hallway toward the elevator. There was more blood, small droplets scattered along the floor. It seemed to lead straight toward the elevator, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I followed the trail, almost against my will. The closer I got to the elevator, The heavier the air seemed to feel, the quiet, the stillness, it all felt wrong. The elevator doors were open, but no one was inside. The elevator was dark, too dark. It didn't feel like an ordinary elevator anymore. Something was out of place, and I didn't want to get any closer, but my legs moved of their own accord. My heart pounded in my ears as I stepped inside, almost as if drawn by some unseen force. And that's when I saw it, the blood. The faint red streaks on the elevator floor, leading to the corner of the small metal compartment. The smell was sharp, metallic, and it made my stomach turn. Then I heard something else. The faintest rustle of movement. My pulse spiked as I turned toward the back corner of the elevator. There she was, Lily. Her body was slumped in the corner of the elevator. Her face pale, her eyes half-lidded and unfocused. She was breathing, but barely. Her clothes were torn, her hair matted with something dark. Blood, I could see it, staining the front of her shirt. I dropped to my knees beside her, my hands trembling as I gently shook her. Lily, wake up, please. Wake up. She stirred slightly, but didn't open her eyes. My breath hitched as I tried to pull her into my arms, but she was heavier than I expected. I could barely move her. Lily, come on, talk to me, honey, please. Her eyelids fluttered, and she blinked once before her lips parted. The words that came from her mouth were barely audible, but I caught them. Karen, she She did it. The words hung in the air, like an accusation that had been years in the making. Karen, the name echoed in my mind. I knew who she was, of course. Everyone knew who Karen Richardson was. But what had she done, and why? Before I could ask more, Lily's eyes rolled back, and she lost consciousness again, leaving me alone with the nightmare that was unfolding. The first thing I remember after Lily went unconscious was the sound of my own breath, ragged, shaky, filling the silence in that elevator. I didn't know how much time passed, but the minutes felt like hours. Every second dragged by, thick with fear and uncertainty. I tried to shake off the panic that was threatening to overwhelm me, but the image of Lily broken and vulnerable in my arms stuck with me. It felt like the world had tilted off its axis, and I was just trying to hold on, waiting for something, anything, to make sense of what had just happened. I couldn't wait any longer. I grabbed Lily's limp body and carefully carried her out of the elevator, my mind racing with frantic thoughts. My first instinct was to get her to a hospital, but there was no way I could carry her all the way down the street. My legs felt weak beneath me, my body shaking as the reality of the situation began to settle in. What if it was too late? What if I was already too late to save her? I managed to get her back to our apartment, where I immediately dialed 911. My hands were trembling so badly that I nearly dropped the phone, but somehow, I got through. I told the operator everything I knew, though even I couldn't fully understand the gravity of the situation. My daughter, she's been hurt. I don't know how, but she's bleeding. She's not responding. Please help. I don't know how long it took for the paramedics to arrive, but it felt like an eternity. Time felt warped, stretching and contracting in odd, dizzying ways. When they finally came through the door, they took over immediately, assessing Lily's condition with practiced precision. One of them checked her pulse while the other began to assess the blood on her clothing and her face. I stood there, frozen, unable to process what was happening. Every part of me wanted to collapse, to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. The world felt like it was closing in around me. Ma'am, one of the paramedics said gently, his voice calm but firm. We need to get her to a hospital right away. She's been shot. I don't know why those words hit me like a sledgehammer, but they did. Shot. My mind couldn't process the full weight of it. How had this happened? Why? And who would do such a thing to my daughter? The paramedics moved quickly, getting Lily onto a stretcher and wheeling her out of the apartment. I didn't even think to grab anything. No purse, no coat, nothing. I just followed them down the stairs, through the lobby, and into the ambulance. I couldn't leave her side. I wouldn't leave her side. The ride to the hospital was a blur. My thoughts were fragmented, broken pieces of images and words that didn't quite connect. All I could think about was Karen, the name repeated in my head like a mantra. Karen Richardson. What had she done to my daughter? How had it come to this? I didn't have the answers, but I knew I had to get them. I needed to know the truth. The hospital was chaotic when we arrived. I was quickly ushered into a waiting room, my heart pounding in my chest as I sat there, not knowing what was happening. I couldn't sit still. I paced, then stopped, then paced again, my mind racing from one horrible thought to the next. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a doctor appeared in the doorway. Her face was grim, her eyes kind but serious. She's stable, the doctor said, her voice soft. But she's in critical condition. The bullet grazed her shoulder and lodged just below her collarbone. We've managed to stop the bleeding, but she needs surgery. My stomach clenched, and I took a sharp breath. Will she be okay? The doctor hesitated, but then nodded. She's strong. We're doing everything we can, but it's going to be a long road to recovery. I nodded numbly, trying to process her words. My daughter was alive, but just barely. And whoever had done this, whoever had pulled the trigger, had nearly taken her from me. The next few hours were a blur of paperwork, hospital staff, and unanswered questions. I could barely focus on anything except the nagging feeling in my gut. I needed to understand what had happened, and I needed to find out who was responsible for hurting my daughter. I didn't have to wait long. A few hours later, the police arrived. A detective, a woman named Detective Saunders, came in to speak with me. She was calm, professional, but there was something about the way she looked at me that made me feel like she already knew more than I did. "I'm sorry for what happened to your daughter," she said gently, sitting across from me. "But we need to ask you a few questions. We're investigating the situation, and we have reason to believe that this might not have been a random act of violence." I nodded, my heart racing. I had no idea what she meant, but I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "What do you mean? Who would do this to Lily? Can you think of anyone who might have had a motive?" Detective Saunders asked. "Anyone who might have wanted to hurt her?" It didn't take me long to come to the answer. "Karen Richardson," I said, my voice shaking. "She's the HOA president. She's been harassing my daughter for weeks. She doesn't like the posts Lily's been making on social media about the HOA. She's been threatening her. I think Karen did this." The detective's eyes narrowed, and she took a slow breath. "We'll need to follow up on that. But right now, we're focused on getting the facts. We'll be speaking with the witnesses who were in the building at the time, and we'll try to gather any surveillance footage." I nodded, but the words didn't quite sink in. Karen, the HOA, it all felt so surreal. How could this have happened? How could a neighborhood, a community, a seemingly safe place, have turned into the site of something so violent? It wasn't until later, after the detective had left and I was sitting in the sterile, white hospital room, that I allowed myself to really feel the weight of what was happening. This wasn't just about a shooting. It was about a system of control. It was about a woman, Karen, who had abused her power for too long. A woman who had made my daughter a target. Lily was still unconscious, but I promised her quietly, softly, that I would make sure she was safe. That I would make sure that truth came out, no matter what it took. This wasn't just about the HOA anymore. It was about justice. It was about protecting my daughter and everyone else who had been living in fear of Karen's twisted reign. This was just the beginning. Weeks following the shooting felt like they were stretching out endlessly before me. An agonizing march toward something I couldn't quite name. Every day that passed felt like a small victory for Karen Richardson and the HOA's tight grip on Riverview Heights. But it also brought Lily closer to recovery physically, at least. Her scars were healing, but the emotional trauma was harder to navigate. She barely spoke about the incident. When she did, it was always in the briefest terms, as if to avoid reliving the nightmare. But I saw the flicker of anger in her eyes, a quiet, simmering rage that made it clear she was ready for this fight. We both were. But that's what this had become, a fight. A war. And it was a war that would take every ounce of strength we had. The moment we were able to leave the hospital, things began to escalate quickly. The news of Lily's shooting had already made its way through the community, though the details were mostly speculative. Some said it was a random act of violence. Others whispered that it had something to do with the HOA's absurd rules. But very few knew the full truth, that it was Karen. That Karen had shot my daughter in cold blood. All because Lily had dared to challenge her power. The first move came from Karen's side, and it was swift and calculated. The HOA, in a shockingly coordinated effort, held an emergency meeting. The timing was suspicious, as it came just days after Lily was discharged from the hospital, and the purpose was clear: damage control. They couldn't let the truth get out, at least not without making sure the board came out of it looking like the victims. I wasn't invited to the meeting, but I had my sources' residents who still had a shred of decency left. From what I gathered, Karen had been unusually quiet at the meeting, but her legal team had been front and center, laying the groundwork for a defense that hinged on one key element. Self-defense. The official story, the HOA, would later spread, was that Karen had acted in fear for her life. The narrative was already in place. Lily had allegedly become unhinged, and Karen had only drawn her weapon in the face of imminent danger. It was the perfect defense for a woman who had spent years building a reputation of being the neighborhood's protector. But it was a lie, and I knew it. Lily wasn't unhinged. She wasn't a threat to anyone. She'd been standing up for what was right, for a community that had long been enslaved to Karen's whims. But the damage was done. Karen's version of events was already circulating in the building, and the board had already started distancing themselves from the shooting, casting it as a tragic misunderstanding. They claimed that Karen was under stress, that she was just trying to protect herself from a young woman who had crossed the line. I was livid. How could they rewrite the truth so easily? How could they twist the story to make Karen the victim? But I knew this fight wasn't going to be won by shouting at the board in the middle of one of their smug meetings. It was going to take something bigger, something they couldn't ignore, and that something was the law. It took several more days for our lawyer to get the ball rolling on filing the official lawsuit against Karen and the HOA. We hired a team of skilled legal experts who specialized in wrongful injury cases. But I knew the real battle wouldn't just be about proving the shooting was intentional. was about exposing the corrupt practices that had allowed Carolyn to get away with years of manipulation and control. It was about showing the world that Karen's reign wasn't just about HOA rules. It was about power, fear, and manipulation. The first thing we did was file a restraining order against Karen. She wasn't allowed within 100 feet of Lily or me. It was a small victory, but it was important. It sent a message that we weren't backing down, and it also gave us time to gather our evidence, to prepare for the fight ahead. I spent every day in the courthouse, going over the fine details of the case with our lawyers. We collected witness statements from the few brave residents who had agreed to come forward, each one telling their own version of how Karen had used her power to silence them, how she had bullied and threatened anyone who disagreed with her. There were documents, emails, texts, and official records showing that Karen had been harassing Lily long before the shooting occurred. But even more damning were the surveillance tapes from the building. They showed Karen entering the elevator before the incident, and they showed her holding something in her hand. A gun. It wasn't a smoking gun, not yet, but it was the evidence we needed to prove that Karen had been more than just an innocent bystander. She had been the aggressor, but we couldn't stop there. The more we dug, the more we uncovered. We started investigating the HOA's finances, and what we found was unsettling. Large sums of money had been allocated for community improvements that never seemed to materialize. The HOA had been siphoning off funds for personal gain projects that never existed, repairs that were never made, and residents who were forced to pay inflated fees for nothing. It wasn't just a case of an overbearing HOA. It was corruption on a massive scale. Lily, still recovering from her injuries, helped as much as she could. Her anger at Karen had transformed into a quiet, focused determination. She was tireless, sifting through public records, finding patterns in the numbers that no one else had seen. It became clear that Karen's control over the neighborhood wasn't just a matter of petty rules. It was a carefully constructed empire, built on fear, intimidation, and fraud. We began to leak the information we had found to the press. Articles started popping up in local papers, and soon the story of Karen's reign of terror in Riverview Heights spread to a broader audience. The more people knew, the harder it was for the HOA to keep up the fight. Karen's allies on the board began to turn on each other, and the cracks in her carefully constructed image began to show. But it wasn't just the press that was catching wind of this, it was the police as well. With the growing public pressure, the investigation into the shooting gained new momentum. Detective Saunders, now with more evidence in hand, reopened the case, and the department began to dig into Karen's past. More and more witnesses came forward. People who had lived in fear of Karen's wrath for years. People who had seen her threaten others, who had felt the sting of her power plays. It didn't take long for the pressure to break Karen. One evening, as I sat at my kitchen table going over yet another stack of paperwork, I received a call from Detective Saunders. Karen had been arrested. The charge was attempted murder, and it wasn't just based on Lily's shooting it. It was based on everything we had uncovered. The financial fraud, the threats, the bullying, the manipulation. Karen's empire was crumbling, and she knew it. But she wasn't going down without a fight. The legal battle that followed would drag on for months, with Karen's lawyers trying everything they could to discredit us, to shift the blame, to paint Lily as the aggressor. But with each passing day, the truth became clearer. The community that had once cowered in fear of Karen began to speak out. The support for Lily and me grew, and eventually, the weight of the evidence became too much for even Karen's powerful allies to ignore. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but in the end, we won. Karen was convicted of attempted murder, along with a host of other charges related to her time as HOA president. The board was disbanded, and a new, more transparent management team was put in place. The community was free, finally, from the chokehold that Karen had maintained for so long. But the true victory wasn't in the legal win, it was in seeing Lily, my daughter, stand up, not just for herself, but for an entire community that had been oppressed for years. She had ignited a spark, and in the end, that spark had turned into a blaze that burned away the darkness. And for the first time in a long time, Riverview Heights felt like a place where justice could truly take root.